The fate of this year's admissions to Boston exam skills will be determined in federal court. That's because a temporary plan for admission without using a standardized test has been challenged by a group representing white and Asian students and parents. The group argues the new policy discriminates by using zip codes as a proxy for race. Supporters of the change say it can increase racial equity in admissions while still reflecting student achievement. In a more recent development, some advocacy groups are trying to support that policy by filing a brief to explain the move are a staff attorney with Lawyers for Civil Rights, Lauren Sampson, and a staff attorney with Greater Boston Legal Services, Janet Vo. I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you for having us, Chris.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris.
I want to start with Janet Vo. Tell me a little bit about the groups representing it in this brief and why you're doing it.
Thank you, Chris. It's a coalition of various groups representing the defendants in this matter, including the NAACP Boston branch, the Greater Boston Latino Network, and the Asian Pacific Islander Civic Action Network, and also Asian American Resource Workshop. And we're also representing 2 Boston families of color who filed the motion to intervene. And this, our involvement comes out of at least with solidarity and with Black and Latinx communities in the fight for ensuring equitable access to education for all students.
I want to talk to Lauren Sampson here because I think for most people in Boston, the notion of the exam school is a place where admissions are driven by merit. But what about the legal framework involved? It seems, on the one hand, you can't cross the line and use racial quotas, but on the other hand, you can't exclude anybody. But what more is there to know about what the legal boundaries are?
Absolutely, Chris. And one thing that we have emphasized in this litigation is that the Supreme Court has made clear on a number of occasions that it is permissible to use race-neutral measures in order to improve diversity and avoid racial isolation at selective public schools like the 3 in this lawsuit. In this instance, there is no more exam. That's not in question. What the plaintiff is challenging is whether or not zip codes can be utilized in considering who to offer admission to for Boston's 3 schools. We certainly think this is an important way of addressing socioeconomic status and the incredible diversity and socioeconomic opportunity available to families across Boston. The plaintiff disagrees and wants to use exclusively GPAs as a measure of who gets admission to these selective public schools.
What about the effect on the Asian population in Boston? Certainly one of the impressions that came out of the hearing on this policy before the school committee last year was there were at least some Asian families, including some poor immigrant families, where the kids spent many years preparing for the entrance exam. This was their strong suit for getting in. And now they might look at this new policy, at least this temporary new policy, as something that's discriminated against them.
Thank you, Chris. The Asian American community isn't a monolith. It's a very diverse community that has a range of socioeconomic experiences. And I think in this situation, the Asian American community as a whole, the clients that we represent, they represent over thousands of families, including those from BPS. They're being used as a wedge pitted against other communities of color, but we stand strongly that this is not a discriminatory policy. One thing that we wanted to emphasize is that a lot of Asian Americans are often lumped together as a lot of Asian Americans are lumped together, but many of the clients that we represent, including those from Southeast Asian communities, they make up a significant portion of Dorchester area. They come from Vietnamese American backgrounds and have high levels of poverty and also low levels of education attainment.
Yeah, Lauren, one of the things that I've drawn from looking at the website put up by the plaintiff group is that they're worried about educational excellence. They're afraid that the quality of education in these exam schools will be compromised in some way. What do you say to that?
At Lawyers for Civil Rights and among the many groups participating in this lawsuit, this has been disproven time and time again. The idea that a particular entrance exam or the use of GPAs standing alone without any context are some kind of perfect predictor of success in these highly selective public schools is simply untrue. One need only cite to the Rappaport study conducted by Harvard University, which noted that these metrics are by no means perfect predictors, that if you were to use other benchmarks, as just one example, MCAS scores, you would still produce a more diverse student body that was able to meet the high standards set by these selective public schools. There is no indication that any one metric, be it GPA standing alone, be it a particular entrance exam, is the best or indeed the only way of achieving an academically excellent student body.
Janet, I imagine any change in policy will create certain expectations among students who might start seeing themselves as possibly getting into one of these schools. That must have happened in the past few months. How do you see this hold up in the plan, this uncertainty affecting these students right now?
Yeah, this hold up is affecting a lot of students, including our clients. One of them is HD. She is a Vietnamese American who lives in Dorchester, 6th grader, is waiting admission on BPS. And I think all our clients and the students are anxiously waiting on this decision that's been held up. And I think one thing that's really important to emphasize is that everyone wants like a fair process for admissions to education, admissions to BPS. And I think that's just one thing that I want to emphasize, that like all parties involved want a fair, equitable access to education.
Lauren, one thing that occurred to me, because zip codes would be a factor. I imagine the pool in each zip code is not going to be totally equal. So isn't it conceivable that you could have a student from one zip code getting in, whereas a student from another zip code with maybe better grades might be left out? Couldn't that happen?
One thing that the interim policy does is create two different pools for admission. So if a student is, if the top 20% of seats at the selective public schools will be reserved for those students that in the general pool have the highest overall grades. And then the other 80% will see seats given out in 10 rounds going based on the different zip codes, with a proportionate number of seats correlating to the size of folks in those zip codes. And I think a very important corrective to what we have seen in the past, which is an overrepresentation of students from certain zip codes accessing the exam schools, even though they're not necessarily sending in more applications, but they are still seeing themselves overrepresented in those schools. This is an effort to make sure that we recognize the socioeconomic imbalances between some of these zip codes, and to ensure, as Janet says, that there is equal access and opportunity for all students to access these public schools.
Janet, we just heard, the argument for fairness as far as increasing diversity, but on the other hand, what about the educational or social value of more diversity in some of these schools?
Yeah, Chris. Diversity is very important for all students and education systems, primarily for like outcome and also the experience that they have. And even though there needs to be a mix of students from different backgrounds, there's so much contributions that students from different backgrounds can provide, and diversity comes in so many different forms, including diversity in like geographic location and neighborhoods that people come from, but also ethnic backgrounds and language and just experiences that can add to the classroom experience. And that is something that's very valuable for the students in the education system.
Lauren, I know that this temporary plan means, not using an admissions exam, which would at least be standardized. But on the other hand, if the plaintiffs want to rely on something else, I guess it would have to be grades. And, you're talking about different schools, different school systems. I mean, are grades consistent?
Chris, it's an excellent point, and one of the reasons why the working group wanted something that was sort of citywide, a way of addressing admissions to exams while recognizing that there are divergences in how grading is done. And there have been allegations of grade inflation, especially at some of the private and parochial schools. What's really notable here is the plaintiff is not asking for some kind of reversion to the status quo for a plan that existed prior to the interim plan. They're asking for something completely different, which is the consideration exclusively of GPAs without any kind of standardizing metric like zip codes. They're asking for the court to do something quite novel here, which to essentially introduce an option C, a third way that was not really before the school committee and was not voted on.
Sure. I'm also wondering here about why you're one of the intervening groups here, because the current plan is being, I imagine, defended by the city or the Boston School Department through their legal staff. So why pile on here and try to make sure you reinforce the message?
One of the reasons why the interveners are involved in this case is that we want to ensure that the voice of the community is heard. And in this situation, particularly, I think it's very important to emphasize the communities that would benefit from this interim policy, particularly from those that are coming from these neighborhoods that would benefit, include the socioeconomic backgrounds. There's so many factors that are in place that we want to ensure that BPS is following through with interim policy.
Lauren, maybe a bigger question here is about the whole measure of merit, because it might involve an exam that is biased just by its design, but also the access to preparation. Isn't there always going to be some kind of inequality involved?
Chris, to some degree, we recognize that there are always going to be socioeconomic disparities, racial disparities, language access barriers when it comes to any kind of benefit or access. And what we believe one of the roles of policymakers should be is to consider those in how you design any kind of policy that would enable access to opportunity. It is important when designing any kind of policy to consider who that policy is for, who it should benefit, and who the population you're seeking to serve. In Boston, a city that is becoming majority and minority, that has a wide variety of language spoken, that is a proud immigrant community, it is important to at least consider all of these elements when it comes to crafting any mechanism for determining who should go to highly selective public schools.
Well, I'd like to thank you both very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
That was Lauren Sampson from Lawyers for Civil Rights and Janet Vo from Greater Boston Legal Services. We'll have more news in just a moment.